My name is Elina Tapio, and in this video I'm going to talk about multimodal interaction, interactional skills for enabling equality and participation. What has caught my attention in recent years in the media is the way interactional skills have been mentioned in many places. Interactional skills have been mentioned as belonging to top 5 or top 3 or top 10 skills that we need in order to succeed in the future. Interactional skills is one of the most important skills that are needed in order to succeed at your work. So that has really caught my attention because I do research on interaction myself, and it has been of course very interesting to see that interaction is now suddenly very important. But I have been thinking, what do people mean when they say interactional skills? What kind of skills does it include? And I was happy to find 3 other people who are interested in this trend too. So me and 3 researchers, we wanted to find out what is meant by interactional skills. And what was really interesting was that now that interactional skills was everywhere in the media and everywhere in public discourse, of course it started to happen that there are many firms and companies who are providing training for people in interactional skills. So when there is a need to develop your skills, there is always somebody who can sell you training or sell you these skills. We found 3,000 web pages in Finland about training provided for people in interactional skills, but we selected more than 300 web pages, which means 300 firms, to look in more detail. And what was found that almost all of the firms, maybe there were 2 or 3 firms that didn't do this, but most of the firms, they draw on leadership studies, psychology, and social psychology. So when they talk about interactional skills, they emphasize personality, emotions, empathy, and group processes. These are very typical research areas in social psychology and psychology. One thing we found out when we wanted to know how the firms are selling interactional skills and how they think people learn to interact better. One thing that we found out, there were many other things, but this was particularly interesting, is that they were selling these kind of standardized tests, and they were very close to standardized personality tests that people were able to take, and through a test you are supposed to find out what kind of a person you are when interacting. And for example, if the training was provided for the company, so all the people were taking the test, and you were able to see whether you were, as a person in interaction, whether you were a blue person or yellow person, and maybe your colleague is a red person. So when you found out that you are a blue person when it comes to your interactional skills or the way you interact, you were taught or made to reflect how to work together with the red person, or how to get along with a yellow person. So this is very familiar to other kind of personality tests. And of course, I am also critical towards these kind of quick tests and tests that actually make interactional skills as something that is in your personality, that is something that is in you. You may be able to change it be or develop your skills, but anyway it makes you alone. It makes you alone responsible for your own skills, and it makes it quite stable that this is what you are and the other person is like that, and then you kind of have to adjust. After this study was made, my question was, what if instead of developing our personality and our interactional skills as linked to our personality, what if instead the goal would be to improve the equality and participation of others? I'm going to introduce you some basic principles of multimodal interaction research. So multimodal interaction research is looking at multiple communicative modes or semiotic resources that are used in interaction. So that's why multimodal, multiple modes, multiple communicative modes, and we are going to talk about those next. Multimodal interaction research is based on empirical research. It means that in that research, the researchers are looking at things we can see, hear, smell, taste, and things that we can capture by video or voice recording or photos for analysis. So multimodal interaction research is not using only things like interviews or questionnaires, or they are not looking at what goes on inside people's head, how do they feel and think about things, but instead they are looking at things that can be actually seen happening. What do people do when they interact with each other? And when I mentioned multiple modes, that refers to communicative modes. And this list is given by Sigrid Norris in her book 2004. She lists these communicative modes. We use other modes in interaction too. These are only based on her own research. So there are others, but this is just a preliminary list, but a good list anyway. And I will go through each communicative mode in another video, which you can find on my YouTube channel, and you will be given the link to that video. It is in Finnish, but it is subtitled in English. So what Sigrid Norris and multimodal interaction researchers are looking is that they are asking what kind of role these different modes play in interaction. And the main message is that far too much attention has been given for spoken or written language, and less is reflected how other communicative modes such as body posture, gaze, and so on work in interaction. So in another video you will go through spoken language, gesture, proxemics, body posture, head movement, gaze, music, print, layout, facial expressions, and sign language, and see how those communicative modes have been researched and what kind of role they play in interaction. So watch that video. I will give you 3 examples from research done by interaction researchers who are doing research from a multimodal viewpoint. So through these 3 examples you can see what are the researchers actually doing in practice. The first example comes from Hans research project at the University of Oulu. In this project which is called Hans comes from a human activity in natural settings, nature as a site for mobility, interaction and socialization. So in this project group, they are researching the significance of nature for how people use language and other communicative modes to interact with one another and accomplish social actions in situ. For example, in this study that you see transitions as sites of socialization in family interaction outdoors, the researchers study family interaction in situation when the family is going to the forest for picking berries or mushrooms. As a Finn myself, I would think that this is something that comes naturally, to know what actions are required for picking mushrooms, how it's done. But through the study, I found out how this is not the case. Picking mushrooms or berries is something that I have been socialized in, and I have learned to do that with others. So this study shows how picking mushrooms, for example, the activity has actually two different phases: searching activity when one scans for mushrooms, and picking activity, and the transition between those stages is something that they look into. So how do we move from searching to picking and to searching again? It sounds very simple and mundane, but it's very interesting to see how they go step by step to show how children are socialized in something as simple as that, as picking mushrooms or berries, and how language, but also gestures and body position and visual and embodied resources are used for guiding children to pick mushrooms, for instance. Their future research has a lot to give for anyone who is interested in leisure activities in natural settings. That's what I believe. Picore is a project where I am working as a researcher myself. It's a project in Humak. The goal of the project is to develop picture communication for situations where people do not share common language to communicate with in ease, and the context is the beginning of asylum process and Finnish reception centers. In this project, I did field work in 4 different reception centers. My goal was to find out how people are using pictures in communication and what kind of needs they have for developing picture communication. What I found out was that the people who worked at the reception centers used multiple communicative modes, visual and embodied communicative modes, for creating space that would support understanding. So people did not share languages, but they used gaze, gestures, body posture, pictures and drawing actively for making each other understood. Another finding was that there is no use to have pictures in communication if people do not orient to shared communicational space. A whole body communication is really needed. The third example comes from my research project in the context of higher education and a university study program where deaf and hearing students who use Finnish Sign Language have been studying for a few decades now. This research project was really interesting, and I'm sure you will find some links to your own experiences. I was looking at one particular lecture hall. The lecture hall is called F105, and you see in the picture this is a very traditional classroom. You see people are, or the chairs are in rows, and there is space for the teacher in front of the classroom. That's where the speaker is, and the students are supposed to sit around those tables. It is a very old building, so the design of the space or the place has a long history already. But the thing is that when the students are using sign language instead of spoken or written language, this room is not very good for that, because if people go and sit in those places that are suggested for them, they can see the teacher, but and a person who's next to them, but you can't see behind. So if the person behind you makes a comment or question to your teacher, you can't see it. But you have to turn around and look there. But then if you turn around and look at your friend behind, you can't see the teacher and so on. So this place is not really enabling the use of sign language or embodied communicative modes like gesture and body posture and so on. So this place is really designed for spoken language, for written language, and for teacher-oriented activities. But when I was looking at what the students did when they came into the classroom, the first 5 minutes, I noticed that they started to take over the place. They moved the tables and the chairs, and they wanted to make sure that that they can see each other, that they have a line of vision between them. So this picture, for example, it illustrates how these two persons are looking at each other and making sure that they can see each other when the lecture begins. So this is before the lecture actually begins. And the person on the left hand side is moving her table and chair a little bit so that they can be sitting in a way that she can see everybody in the classroom and the teacher, of course. So the finding of this article was to say that to some extent people can kind of be against the template the space or the place gives them. So the place and the space is suggesting that this is where you should interact in this way. You are supposed to be passive, you are supposed to speak, you are supposed to look at the teacher, but then the students actually are a little bit rebelling against that, and they want to interact with each other, and they want to use sign language when communicating with each other. So now the space actually starts to enable visual embodied communication. So finally, my message in this video is to ask you to pay special attention to asymmetry, which means that the communicative modes and resources, which means then again languages, different language varieties, spoken language, written language, and then visual and embodied resources such as gaze or gestures and so on. Those resources are not the same for everyone. They are not symmetrical in most of the situations, maybe never. We have very different past experiences with different communicative modes. Somebody is very used and skillful in using gaze, and somebody really pays attention to where people sit and if you can see each other. Some people rely on their spoken language and they are very good at speaking, and some people are very much using gestures when talking or communicating with each other. But also the reason why resources are not the same for everyone and not everybody has access to such resources is that the environment, as seen in the classroom example, because the environment rules more than we know. So the moment we go to a place or space, whether it is a shop or a meeting room or a classroom or a place in the forest, the moment we enter there, we are given norms and rules. We know them, how we know how we are supposed to behave. We know if this is a place where you are supposed to talk. We know if this is a place where you are supposed to use your body a lot and interact with your body, and so on. We know if you are supposed to be on your own or work in a group. So these are the things that kind of set rules and norms on how to interact with each other. But although we have these things that might actually limit us, people have resources and we can adjust the place or the norms, and we can adjust and take over places, as it was seen in the last research example of how the students actively managed the place they were in. So my message to you is that, and to myself, is that when it is very good to reflect on your own interaction, to reflect how you use different communicative modes when interacting with people. But the most important thing is that you reflect how you give space for others to use communicative modes. Whether you actually pay attention to how people are communicating to you, whether you pay attention if people can, for example, see each other, and whether you, when you are giving instructions for other people how they should go about, whether you actually enable or disable the use of different communicative modes, because that all is very much linked to participation. So by providing room for different communicative modes, you provide room for participation. So this was the message of that video, and here you can see some of the photo credits that weren't shown in the previous slides.